community is bigger and bigger by the day, and we're pleased to see all of you here. We have farmers, we have agribusiness professionals, agricultural professionals, students, aspiring farmers. We're all here. We've gathered here together to share knowledge. Thank you for making the time to join us. From our previous lessons in this module, we looked at Napier. We had a part 1 and 2 on Napier, where we very able David Miner took us through the economics of Napier. We also looked at the nutritional value. If you've missed those sessions, kindly go to Perfometer YouTube channel. We have those recordings there. We also looked at using haze and straws, optimizing haze and straws in our feed systems, in our TMRs. And today we're here to learn more about grasses. Wow, grasses. And I am particularly interested in this because I don't know much about grasses, and I'm very interested to learn more today. And to take us through this topic, we are truly honored to have our facilitator, Dr. Solomon Waweru Mwendia. He's a leading forage agronomy scientist with almost 20 years of experience in research for development across Africa. Dr. Mwendia holds a bachelor's in animal production, a master's in livestock production systems, and a PhD in forage agronomy. He has served within Kenya's research systems and also with international organizations, including Alliance of Biodiversity International and SEAT, where he has championed innovations in forage improvement, seed systems, and sustainable livestock productivity. His work spans across Africa, including Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia, and of course, Kenya, where he's been involved in shaping research and policy and on-farm practices around forage systems. Over the years, he's also been the author of numerous research papers, technical reports, and policy briefs. With his technical expertise and regional experience, Dr. Mwendia will guide us today through the science and the practice of improved grasses. And without further ado, I'd like to warmly welcome Dr. Mwendia as he takes us through today's lesson. Karibu sana, Daktari.
Thank you, Jerry, for the benign introduction, and hello, everyone. I think today we are going to discuss more about grasses. Last time I've just heard there was a topic on Napier grass, so today we shall look at more important grasses that can also be used to actually improve our livestock systems. Give me a minute as I share my screen, and kindly let me know when that happens, if you can see my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we're able to see it, Daktari.
Yeah, thank you. As you have already said, I have worked a bit around this topic on grasses. Of course, ruminants, the basic feed is roughage, largely that comes from grasses. And I know for quite some time, and many of people in this room, and also for Kenyans, we are quite familiar with the Napier grass. But over time, we have been trying to diversify that genetic base of what can be fed to animals. And I come from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, which has now an alliance with the Alliance of Biodiversity International, and specifically the Tropical Forages Program. And this program, we actually run it right away from the forage breeding, where we have specified or largely concentrated allowed 2 varieties, which you'll see. And we actually in Latin America, Africa, and also in Asia, in a number of countries. So today we shall look a bit of establishment, management, and feeding value of 2 grasses. And to do that, I have given you a snapshot of what I'll go through. I'll look a bit of introduction, look at the forage suitability, especially for the grasses by agroecological zones. We shall also look at a tropical forages tool. It's a tool that is online and free that you can use actually to select forages depending on where you are, not just for grasses, but also include other legumes. We shall also look at selected forages, in this case, the Brachiaria, that are also known as Eurocroa, or the Panicums, also known as megadisas. And I think it's in the recent past that these two genus have been changed by the people taxonomists into the two names I've just mentioned. So for Brachiaria, when I say Brachiaria or Eurocroa, I refer to the same thing, or Panicum and Megadisas, I refer to the same thing. We look a bit on establishment and what lines we have in the market that have been promoted in different places, in different countries, and also have an example of what these forages can actually do. We shall be looking a bit at an experiment around milk productivity, but similar results can also be realized when you think of meat. Also, to mention a bit about the dry matter concept, which I have found farmers confounding a lot. We need to be a bit clear on how the animals take the adequate quantities, amount of feed per day. Also, so how these forages, or rather the grasses we have here in question, can be conserved. And also looking at the gap, because depending on the livestock population in this country, we do know there is a big gap in terms of forage deficit, including what is cultivated, all the crop residues, the animals still don't get enough. And also we shall be having a snapshot on how these Eurocroa have extended in Kenya and beyond, looking at the global span, and have some future outlook in terms of what we think is likely to happen and where the efforts should be going to. Now, as a way of introduction, I have three terms here: fodder, forages, and feed, that sometimes are used interchangeably and probably not with very nice fitting. You may use one when you actually want to mean the other. And when we say fodder, we are actually looking at all refuges fed to livestock, whether it is cultivated or crop residues. But when we say forages, we refer specifically to actually crops that are purposely grown to feed livestock. And when we say feed, it actually combines the two, including the concentrates. And we know in the livestock sector, between 55 and 70% of the costs that go into this livestock enterprise are actually feed related. And that squared tells you if you succeed in this area, you are probably by the same percentage on the way, but the same percentage towards the success in your enterprise. But we know livestock productivity in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya included, is heavily dependent on crop residues that we know sometimes they are of low quality. And unless if you try to mitigate that, you may not realize the potential production of your animal. And the other challenge I have come across many farms have gone is lack of actually feed planning, call it feed budgeting, if you like, just like we've planned for our families, knowing that from January to December we have adequate feed, enough adequate food for the family. You also need to do a similar thing for your livestock, depending on the number of animals you have. And although zero productivity, in some cases we see that the cattle population is actually increasing, and so is the human population, and therefore going forward we expect more rising demand for animal source foods, whether it's milk or meat, and therefore there's need to have a keen eye on improved cultivated forages. When we think of growing these forages, it's also good to think about where you're growing them, the agroecological zones. And largely here we have 4 areas, some of which you might be familiar with. And second column here, I've given you examples of grasses and further legumes, which probably could fit in such context. And the first one is the semi-arid areas that can have an elevation of 1,000 to 1,800 meters above sea level. and receive at least 650 millimeters of milk every year. And you can see here we have some grasses that are relatively adapted to such areas, like Cenchrus cerealis, and Eragrostis superba, and Enteropogon, and Lablab, and Cowpea. They can fit here, and some of these, I know they occur naturally. Some of them have actually been also licensed in Kenya, registered through the cafes, but you'll find that the challenge often is the seed system, such that if you want to acquire the seed, sometimes they are not readily available. The other category is the warm, wet, medium altitude, where it ranges between 1,200 to 1,850 meters, and may be receiving between 1,000 and 2,500 millimeters of rainfall every year. And here you have an example of grasses which can fit there. And Eurocroa or Brachiaria, which I'll be talking about, can fit here very well. Also the Panicums, also oat and grasses, among others. And for the legumes that can also go well in such an environment include Calliandra, Desmodium, and Lucina. The other category is cool, wet, and medium altitude, elevation of about 1,850 meters to about 2,400 meters above sea level, and receiving relatively large amount of rainfall, 1,000 to 2,500 millimeters of rainfall. And again, we have an array of grasses that can also fit there, including napier grass, oat, Rhodes grass, some brachiaria can fit there, like basilisk, which is a cultivar. Kikuyu grass can also do there, and sweet potato, although it's dual purpose and not necessarily a legume, but connects very well or contribute to animal feeds very nicely, especially the calves. You can also grow some legumes here, like desmodium and lucerne. Now, the cooled, wet, high altitude with very high elevations that can expand beyond 2,400 to about 3,000, receiving also quite an amount of rainfall. We have reduced options for such places because it can be cold, and most of the forages we have that are C3 would fit here, unlike C4, where we have the Eurocroa or the Megadisas being a C4. Here you can grow largely the C3 like oats or ryegrass. And although Kikuyu grass is a C4, we have found that it can also adapt in such a context relatively well. And for the legumes you can grow there, you can think about vetch, you can think about lupin or lucerne. And again, the question boils down to availability of seeds, but some of these can also be available through the community-based organizations. Now, to put a bit this into context, when we think of the semi-arid or the agroecological zones I have just mentioned, to think more logically, you can pick the areas where this would fall realistically. Like for the semi-arid, as an example, it's more parts of the northern parts of Kenya or eastern part. And when you go to the warm, wet, medium altitude, you can think of Taita Hills all the way to southern Nyanza and a number of counties in between there already listed. And when we think of the cold, wet, medium altitude, is like places like Trans Nzoia, where we know a lot of corn, maize is grown. A number of counties also there, including districts in counties in central Kenya. And when we think of the cold, wet, high altitude, these are really places that are quite elevated, like the Mau Narok, Cherangani Hills, that neighbors Trans Nzoia, Mount Elgon also around Trans Nzoia, and then Nyandarua, and around the counties where they move close to the Aberdare ridges and also around Mount Kenya. Now, to beef up what the table I showed earlier about grasses or legumes that can fit in different agroecological zones, there's a tool called Tropical Forages Tool. It's free and it's online. And actually, it can give you more detail about quite a number of forages that can actually be selected and depending on where you are. And I've just clicked that link and I wanted to show you it have a number of options here, but I want to just click on the fact sheet, and from A to Z, where you see highlighted green, it means there are a number of forages at each of those that start with those letters. And for example, if you go to Brachiaria, you can see there are a number of Brachiarias. And if you click further, you'll see that you can be able to get the details, including all the information you may need actually to help you establish. For example, the distribution, application, environment, and soil requirement, what it would require, the pH, the temperatures, and also agronomy. If you click this link, it will give you the details of how you can actually take care of it from all the way from establishment, including fertility, whether there are pest and diseases challenges, also the feeding value, and further information, and what you would expect in terms of yields, and of course from different places on the globe, and also animal production. So it's detailed and really nice for any person interested in livestock, knowing these grasses and options. The other options that I also find very good about it is where you can actually be able to select. If you click on the selecting, you see this window comes with populated about 172 different forage grasses. This could be grasses or actually legumes. And the good thing is that you can actually be able to define, for example, out of the forages that have minimal risks to the environment, towards those have high risks. So we have like 101 that have no risk. You can go further and actually filter, see the intended use you want to grow that forage for. For example, you can click cut and carry, which is familiar in most of our smallholder farming systems. And you can even further go and select the altitude you are thinking about, or where, depending on the context you are in. You can say, for example, 1,000. And what you realize when you select, the number here drops. It means this window here, these are the forages that can fit the context you're actually defining. You can even further here indicate the amount of rainfall you receive in that particular area, say 800. And if you click enter, it should be able to filter and only leave you in this window all the forages that can fit under that context. And you can see there are quite a number. Some of them legumes, like this grass can still fit under what we have defined. So it's quite flexible. You can actually define depending on their context. You have Croris Guyana there, quite a number. So you can again pick and go and check the details from the same tool where I had shown you the groceries, in terms of where you can get the details of how to establish any of those. But I know one of the biggest challenges is when it comes to seed availability. Sometimes you can get tiny amount of seeds from research stations, forage gene banks, and I think it's possible to try and see how it can work. Let me go back. Yeah, so largely, when we say of these forages, remember you said forages are cultivated specifically to feed your livestock. They fall into three main categories. The grasses, which we look a bit more today. And we know grasses are planted actually globally in excess of 150 million hectares. And here I have an example of a pictorial example of a Brachiaria mulatto 2. And this is one of the hybrids actually that is a hybrid that has been developed from our program. And it comes with multiple benefits, for example, like good quality feed. It can also be able to tolerate in relatively drought areas. And it has an advantage of soil improvement in terms of sequestering carbon through their own roots. And the second category is already what we have talked about, legumes. And for example, you have a silver leaf. You can have many other examples, in desmodium. And foraging shrubs and trees that are mainly usually legumes. although there are exceptions like mulberry, which may not be a legume, but of course has high good protein, and coriander. And all these benefits are connected to this, whether they are grasses, legumes, or forage shrubs and trees. Specifically for legumes, they do nitrogen, biological nitrogen fixation, and also provide a high good protein. Examples of improved forages coming from the Eurocloa hybrids, which we have developed, is mulatto 2, and they have attributes like I'm showing here. High crude protein, they are highly palatable, and as you can see, commonly across these grasses, they have more leaves compared to the stem, and we know more nutrients are usually in the leaves. So that's one of the criteria that makes them better in terms of quality, and also they become better in terms of digestibility because more fibers are often in the stem. These brachiarias, largely, they are also tolerant to acidic soils, which may be prevalent in many parts of our country, including especially like Western Kenya. And they are also tolerant to some diseases like spittle bug that may not be a challenge here. Like, for example, in Latin America, this has been a big challenge. And for Africa, what we have seen a bit in terms of this hybrid is to do with the spider mite. And I've already said they can also be relatively drought tolerant. For example, what we have here, Camelo. Camelo actually has been registered by CAFIS this year. And as you can see from the word, there's a word camel there. And you know a camel is an animal that can thrive in harsh conditions. And this variety is actually bred for relatively harsh conditions that are not well endowed with enough rainfall, and they're also deep rooting, and it's a hybrid actually. And Cayman can tolerate a bit of waterlogging if when it rains excess, and but also provide a good quality material. When harvested at the right stage for all these materials, you find that the crude protein can be about 17%. So largely for grasses, it's the stage you really harvest that determines the quality you get. And as we know, just like any other crop, remember we have said the forages is cultivated, specifically for livestock. You have to start with the land preparation. And ideally land preparation, this allows you to actually eradicate the weeds and get them dry well before you establish. And therefore, this means you should be able to do well before the start of rains for the land preparation to be successful. Where you have obnoxious or notorious weeds like couch grass, you would have adequate time to actually eradicate them with the right herbicides. And also plowing the land makes the seed, the soils loose so that the seed can get in proper contact with the soil when sown or planted. And also the soil will be able to absorb enough moisture and allow water to percolate nicely. And often I've seen people confusing a seed bed and nursery, but seed bed can go to is whatever land you prepare to plant in a crop. It can span from 1 acre to 1,000 acres, but for a nursery, we know it's usually a small piece of place. And here I do have pictorial representation of land already plowed through machinery. And one key thing for the pasture grasses is that the seeds are usually tiny. If you think of maize seed or bean, the seeds coming for the grasses are usually tiny. And if you don't have a fine soil tilth, it can be a challenge to have a proper seed soil contact. And you may end up having low establishment because of such. So you need to make sure your seed bed is well prepared ahead of time and has the correct fine tilth. If you look at this first photo, you can see the big soil clods here. Definitely here you cannot have a nice seed soil contact. Unlike the second picture here, which you can see is very well prepared, even harrowed and ready to receive seeds. Forage nurseries, I have already alluded to this, is where you can make a nursery well again ahead of even in the dry season, because here you can be able to take care of them and do it like a month ahead of the rainy season, so that by the time the rainy season comes in, you do have your seedlings ready to be transplanted. And this especially applies to forages that require tender love and care. That means if you plant them to the seedbed you may not directly, you may not be able to, for example, do proper weeding, or they can be attacked easily, probably by pests, which you may find it difficult to control. So ideally, nurseries, as I've said, should be well ahead of beginning of the season, so that when the season comes, you can transplant direct, and that will save you time. Because once you establish correctly, your grass should just continue flourishing and thriving and developing the roots. And for example, you can put in a nursery Brachiaria or the Eurocry or even Caliandra seeds, so that when the rain comes, you already have material that you can transplant direct to the seed bed. And the rule of the thumb here is that the smaller the seed, the fine the soil till should be, as I said, again, to enhance the soil seed contact. And for the seeds that are very tiny, it's key and very important to note that they should not be buried beyond a centimeter, at least max 2 centimeter. If you go beyond that, you may have all the other parameters well set, but you end up not having all your seeds coming out, and it's because they were buried too deep and they may not see the light of the day. So it's usually important to make sure that pasture seeds are not buried too deep. A centimeter below should suffice. And once this you can also be able to compact the seed bed a bit to allow proper soil contact. Otherwise, if the seeds hang loosely into the soil, again, you may end up having a low establishment rate. And we want to have maximum seed establishment. And the other parameter I forgot to say at the beginning, always before you plant the seeds, whether it's the nurseries, it's always good to have an idea of the germination percentage, so that if it's a bit low, you can adjust accordingly, so that you have a better stand when in terms of seed establishment, whether in the nursery or if you had planted directly. Now, when the planting and sowing, of course, happens once you have the rains have hit. You may be planting from materials that is coming from the nursery, or sometimes you can just plant directly. And this should happen when the soils have adequate moisture, and ideally should have rained, for example, for about 3 consecutive days before sowing. And therefore, this is where you'll find the advantage of establishing nurseries and only coming to plant when the rains have come, so your seedlings will just establish and continue thriving. And most seeds will not survive in waterlogged soil conditions, and therefore, well draining a seed bed is good to make sure that waterlogging doesn't actually kill your seedlings. And make the necessary furrows or hills, depending on the forage. Of course, different forage types, whether it's a Eurocloa or the Panicum, they have different seed rates depending on their seed size, and you'll see this later. And for good establishment, you can also apply phosphorus. Phosphorus we know is key for root establishment, so that will be key. And you can as well use a farmyard manure, probably sometimes readily available. But my experience, I've shown that you never get enough farmyard manure even with the farmers. And of course, as we know, most of our farms are mixed farming. Sometimes the manure goes to priority food crops as opposed to pastures. Probably there's need to also take care or good care of the pastures for them to stay long and thrive better for a longer time. And some of these grasses that actually the panicum and maximum, they are perennial in nature. And once nicely established, they can stay for years, even beyond 10 years. And with good management, I mean when they are well fed. The key thing to note there is that whenever they are harvested and taken to the animal, you are mining the soil. And if you don't get soil fertility corrected, then your yields will dwindle over time, and eventually you get a stand that cannot last. In some cases, we have had some of these pasture grasses, the Eurocroa or the Panicums, staying even for over 20 years, for example, in Latin America. But this strongly stems with the good management on the soil. So more specifically here, when we think of Brachiaria, and I already alluded to this, you can either plant directly, this column number 1, or transplanting. This comes from the nursery, which I've just explained a bit in detail, or you can use the splits, which is more vegetative. And the seed rate for the Brachiaria, actually all of them, is about 8 kilos per hectare. And if you scale down, this can go to about 3.2 kilos per acre. And you can use the spacing at 30 centimeter between hills and 45 centimeter between rows. And again, you can plant using a fertilizer that rich in P, the phosphorus, at about 200 kg per hectare, about 8 kg per acre. And you can pinch about 4 or 5 seeds and plant per hole if you are going by holes. And otherwise, you can also go broadcasting, which sometimes myself I don't prefer because it requires more seed rate. It may require more than this per acre, and sometimes also the seed doesn't get a nice contact with the soil, which is key for establishment. And also the seed distribution may be skewed, and this you end up having a lower plant population. Transplanting, as I have already indicated about before establishing a nursery, then you only transplant when the rains come. And this can apply to a crop like Brachiaria, which we have found quite ideal. So the farmers, they can make the nurseries, and this can sometimes, there are cases where even women and youth do nurseries, and they can be able to sell also, kind of form a business around that. And nursery is just about 1 meter width, and similar to those who have done carrots, probably that's the same management you would require. And 1 meter width so that you can be able to manage your nursery from either side without much struggle. But the key thing again to note here is that it will require also a fine soil tilth, and it can cover the length you wish as long as you're able to manipulate from either side because it's only 1 meter width. But also remember the seed should not be deeper than 2 centimeter. And also make sure here you establish a proper soil seed contact by compacting a bit. And now using the split, just like a napier grass, which I know most of us are familiar with, and in any case, it was actually covered last time I have just had. You already need to have prepared your land, and you can use vegetative material from earlier establishment. You can cut splits, and the key thing here is to make sure that the splits have a bit of roots, which you can trim a bit, also the shoot, to avoid the further soil moisture due to transpiration before your split actually establishes the root. And the spacing can again be about 30 centimeter by 45 or 30 by 30. You end up even having an area cover. But usually the disadvantage is that using splits can be very laborious, especially where you are covering a relatively bigger piece of land. You can imagine planting 2 acres or with the splits. First of all, it will be a challenge getting enough material, unless if you do it gradually over time. 2 acres probably would only require about 8 kilos because this is a hectare, or about 6.4 kilos. But for the same terms of vegetative material, you require a lot of material. Even to transport is also a cost there. But it's doable. I've seen farmers starting with splits and over time expanding to about 3-4 acres. And the key thing there also, even when you use the splits, even if they are hybrids, like I have just mentioned, they don't use their vigor, they still remain true to the attributes of that hybrid. Now, if you look at Panicum, the megadicers, as another example, still the land preparation would apply, and the seed rate here is much lower. Per hectare, you can take between 2 to 3 kilos. And for those who are familiar with the Panicum, if you look at the seeds are much tiny, and that's why the seed rate actually drops. And this means that you can take by up to about 1.2 kilos per acre. And here you can also do a drill or furrow 50 centimeter apart. Broadcasting also possible, but as I said earlier, for the brachiaria, it will require a much higher seed rate. Excuse a bit. So it will also require phosphorus, and what we have seen over time is that panicums require more fertile soil than Eurocroa or the Brachiaria, because one, they are more productive also, and for those who have seen panicum fields, they grow very fast, very quickly. That means they are also taking nutrients from the soil. And so therefore top dressing annually between 200 to 400 kilos per year, or about 80 to 60 per acre per year, is meaningful to allow actually proper establishment that drives over years, and also make sure that every crop, every harvest, you have a substantial amount of yields per unit area. And a bit more specifically, we can look at different types, like the pictorial, which is very clear here, is about a cultivar called Zares. It's also a brachiaria, and you can see it has a good palatability, meaning that it's really acceptable to the animals. And if you look at this picture, you do have more leaves than the stems, meaning that the selection by the animals against the stem will not occur. Therefore, the animal can actually eat everything. It has good digestibility that can go up to 70%, largely governed again by the stage you harvest. If you harvest too late, the digestibility will be going down. And the crude protein also governed by when you harvest can go up to 14%, which is good. But it doesn't quite tolerate waterlogging, so it wouldn't require area where water logs for a long time, unlike the hybrid I showed called Cayman. Is in terms of drought tolerance, is medium. To shade is also relatively good, and it can thrive in areas that receive between 900 to 300,000 millimeters of rainfall per year. And the seed rate, we had already talked about the seed depth, and you'll find even the subsequent lines or provenances that I'll show, this will largely apply. And you can see the production potential can be between 10 and 18 tons of dry matter per year. In extreme cases, it can go even to 20 to 30. But this, again, will be largely governed by the external factors and also internal management, whether you get adequate rainfall. So those variables also make the yield vary. And it's also adaptable to between 4 to 8 soil pH, which is also good. So that because we know in most farms, the soil acidity is a challenge. And therefore, it means that it can really fit for the farmers. Another cultivar is actually basilisk, and where the difference between cultivars and hybrid is, of course, hybrids, it means there has been 2 or 3 that have been crossed. But for cultivars, it's the way they occur naturally, but they have been selected for attributes so that they can be able to go to commercial and also be cultivated. So nothing has been changed in their genetic makeup with the breeding. And here's an example of basilisk, which we also drew on-farm trials. Like this is in Busia. You can see it can be very herbaceous, again, very leafy, with a good, and the soils actually where we had planted this were relatively poor. And what I have also discovered, even with the farmers around Meru, they say it can perform relatively better than most grasses, even other panicum and Eurocroa in cold areas, which is not usually the case for the brachiaria. So if you look at the attributes, also it has a nice attributes. The digestibility can go up to 60, crude protein 10%, tolerance to waterlogging is moderate. Again, rainfall and seed rate remains the same, and also the management largely the same. And germination can take 7 to 21 days. But days to fast cut for nearly all these grasses I'm talking about will be in about 90 days, because from the seeds, they take time to get to the fast cut. But later after that, you can actually harvest at shorter intervals, especially during wet season, between 25 to 45, or during dry season, it can go a bit up to 60 to 70 days. So that is key, so that you know how to manage well. And again, the dry matter content would vary depending on the factors I have mentioned earlier. It's good to note that even these forages can be grazed directly if you have a number of acres or paddocks. You can do the rotation. The animals can graze directly. It's not necessarily that they must be harvested under cut and carry. And keep in mind that the cut and carry zero grazing is or came about as a result of land constraint. So clearly, these forages can be grazed directly or other cut and carry context. Now, Cobra is a hybrid, you can see. So it means the two or three have been crossed. And again, with nice attributes like digestibility, which is key. Crude protein can go up to 18, and minimum rainfall about 1800 millimeters. The seed rate remains the same, and about the same attributes as I said earlier, like 90 days to fast cut from her establishment. And you can see this pictorial presentation. These are actually farms. And here I am with my colleague. This is actually in Meru, and you can see it's quite herbaceous, and probably might think it's actually napier grass. It means this crop has been getting enough manure. That's why it looks dark, just dark green, just like a well-nourished maize crop that has been top dressed. And remember what we said, with the good management, this crop can stay beyond 10 years before you require any replanting or reestablishment. Another good hybrid is Mulatto 2, which was also among the first hybrids that were developed by our program. The palatability and all the attributes, as I mentioned earlier, for the others would also apply for Mulatto 2. And you can see again, like this guy here, the stems are minimal. You have more of leaves, which I really like, meaning that the animal will actually ingest nearly everything. Cayman, another hybrid, is an example. And I will have pictorial representation, the same attributes, and it's actually registered also in Kenya by KEFIS. Mulatto 2 is also registered. Camera, as I said, including Cobra. So those have been ratified by KEFIS, and seeds can be appropriated from the private sector. Camelo, I have already talked about this for relatively drought areas. And as I was saying, they can be grazed directly as long as there's management like rotational, or you don't overpopulate the number of animals that are grazing in for a long time. If you have a proper rotational cycle along the paddocks, should be good enough for grazing directly, but also for cut and carry, it can perform. Now we come to the megadisas. This is now different from the Eurocroa or Brachiaria, and one of the cultivars. Remember, cultivar, it means there is no crossing. It's the way it occurred naturally. And one of the prominent cultivar we have is Mombasa, that actually is also registered in Kenya. And you can see, just like the previous pictorial, this is also in Meru. More leaves, less stems. Protein can go up to 14%, and palatability also good. And you see the planting seed density much lower than for the Brachiaria because of the smaller and tiny seeds. And dry matter can also be very high. Of course, they are relatively heavy, more feeders than actually the Eurocloa. But with good management, they can again also live in your portion that has been established for a long time. Another, but I know this one is not registered in Kenya, is Tanzania. It's Panicum, Tanzania, also very herbaceous. And you can see in this photo, this is also in Meru. You might think it's Napier. It's neither Napier, it's Panicum, nor it's not also Eurocroa. And you can see the digestibility can also be good, and minimum rainfall about 1,800 meters, 3 meters per year. And again, similar management attributes and potential yield over time. And once they have enough manually, you can actually give you robust, very good producers in terms of the dry matter for your livestock. Panicum, of course, Maasai is another one. You can see relatively small, narrow reefs, but can also be herbaceous. Actually, this is in Bungoma. Very nice also to make hay. By the way, these materials can also be conserved in the form of hay because the stem doesn't have a lot of water. They don't have stem that accumulates a lot of water like happens with the napier. And again, similar attributes for Panicum Maasai. And Maasai was actually registered this year. Also now going forward, likely to be the private sector. And here I clearly show one of the actual experiment I did with one of those materials, actually a cobra. Cobra, which I've said is one of the hybrids, Eurocroa. And we took from week 1 to week number 8. Those are 2 months. And from week 1 to week 2, we just measured the amount of milk the animals were producing in the morning and in the evening. And this is at the farmer practice there. Then on the 3rd week, we transitioned these animals, the same animals, to 50% farmer practice and 50% intervention meaning including or infusing brachiaria. And you can see the milk went up for both the morning and evening. And then for the week 4 and week 5, it was 100% now cobra. And you can see there was again an increase in milk for both in the morning and in the afternoon. And after week 5, we went back to what was happening at the transitional zone, 50% farmer practice, 50% cobra. And again, you can see milk started dropping. And by the time we went back to farmer practice, that is similar to here, again, the milk production went to the same level. And of course, this can actually happen within the animal that's lactating. And you can clearly see that we realized, in this case, we realized 15% change in or increase in milk. And this was only for the change of brachiaria compared to what farmers do. And even this tells you even for the other material, the same story would apply actually. And we know that percentage increase in milk can go even up to 40%, especially where you have improved the animal genetics. But this clearly shows even with what the farmers have at the genetic level in terms of livestock, you can still manipulate and get more milk with the inclusion of improved forages that are leafier, better in terms of digestion. Now, just to mention about the dry matter concept, which in the field I've seen a lot farmers saying the animal actually require dry matter, and we agree, all of us, that the green material may contain up to 5% of water, and the remaining percent constitute the dry matter. For example, here, if you have napier or oat, or the rhodes grass or the banana stems, they all have water, which can go up to 85%, probably even more for banana. But once you extract all the water, what remains is the dry matter. And the key thing, that dry matter should have the nutrient, whether it is the crude protein or metabolizable energy. That means if your grass was harvested at the correct stage, even after removing the water here, it should retain those nutrients in these materials. And that's where sometimes the farmer confused and they think then dry matter, for example, if you think of maize stovers, then it should be the best for the animal. But by the stovers themselves, we already know they are very low in terms, first of all, digestibility, and all the nutrients were actually mobilized to the grain. So already, even if they are dry, they don't have those nutrients. So it's not just about dry matter. Is that matter, does it have the nutrients? If not, even if you feed the animal, it will not get the adequate amount of nutrients that's required. And I think this really need to be amplified very nicely, especially for the farmers, so that they don't keep getting confused, assuming that if your cow is, say, 400 kilos, and as long as it gets 12 kilograms of dry matter, that is it. It may get 12 kilograms of dry matter per day, but inside the dry matter, that if it doesn't have those two key nutrients, metabolizable energy and crude protein, then you don't expect nice performance from that particular animal. In terms of conservation, I know most of us, we already know it. The forage grasses I've mentioned, they can either go either way here. It can be silage or hay, but largely what I've found with most farms, if they have not invested, it may be relatively difficult to do the silage, especially also if they don't have the technique. But I think it's also growing. For those who can be able to do even a large scale pit, even better, the same material would fit very well. What I found relatively easy is actually for the farmers who can be able to make hay. These materials we have talked about can fit very well because you only require 2-3 days drying in the sun, or if possible under the shade, which is usually better. You should be able to get very good quality hay, and which can help you very well in terms of your animal feed planning or feed budgeting. Because for a daily cow, that's 400 kilos. If it takes about 12 kilos of dry matter per day, that means maybe a bale of hay weighing about 15, 13 kilos should be enough for your cow that particular day. And depending on the number of cows, you can be able to count and be able to budget for your livestock. As long as you harvested this grass at the right stage, it's not straw, that they don't have either crude protein or metabolizable energy. So the key thing whenever you are making hay or buying hay, you're actually buying nutrients. It's not the volume or the kilos. You should always reflect that it's the nutrients you are buying, not the kilos of the dry matter. And this is just pictorial representation I just got from Rift Valley, also showing how you can make hay and also have a hay barn, and you can again be able to do your further budgeting depending on your herd size. Now, in Kenya, for a recent publication we have done after looking at a number of countries in Africa, I think up to about 15. This is the implication for Kenya, an overview. And for cultivated forage deficit, and these figures are in 100 tons, over the next 10 years, we should be about 88,000. And forage seed requirement to actually bridge the gap, we have found out you need at least 26,000, and this again in tons of different seeds. And in this case, we actually used panicums and brachiaria. And we also looked at legumes and used examples of lab or cowpea, because those are annual, but that are for human consumption, but they can also form very good source of animal protein. And land requirement that will be required to actually cover the gap will be about 561,000 hectares of cultivated forages. And people that would be required, or household that would be required, farmers to adopt this around the 652 to just close the gap. Remember, I said the population, animal population is also growing, so is the human population. So if this is not taken seriously, the gap will continue widening. And the potential seed market value in 1,000 USD is like 164,000. And the potential forage crop value again in 10,000 USD is about 158. So for you think of a forage business and all that, as we go into market-oriented or intensify market-oriented dairy beef production, I think forage will come in handy, so that the animals can be able to be productive and over a shorter period of time. So this message have implications around, of course, the three areas: the growing demand for animal source food, the climate change, because these materials, you have just seen, they can adapt and help the farmers to cope in a relatively difficult situation that have been as a result of climate change. Seed requirement bears opportunities. You can think of the forage seed system and private sector engagement, forage adoption and employment creation. Like in Western Kenya, we already saw some youth groups that are already making good quality hay from some of these improved forages and selling the hay to those who actually have the animal. And for sure, to have this gap closed, we need more hectares of land, and as I already given you an indication, and improved forages, and also thousands of adopters taking up cultivated forage. In terms of an overview, in terms of Irokora hybrids, the materials we have developed, looking at the globe, is more actually adapted within Latin America, adopted rather. And in Africa, you can see on this coloring scale, the dark blue coloring scale, where it's darker, it means they have really intensified. And actually, to be honest, is for example, in Latin America, we have over 100 million hectares covered with the Eurocroa grasses alone. Of course, the systems there are different. They are more grazing and also adapted to, or rather, concentrating on live and beef production, unlike the smallholder in Kenya, where we have dairy thriving. But within the African continent, you can see Kenya a bit different from the others. And so far, we estimate hybrid Iroquois, the Brachiaria, cover at least about 18,000 in the Kenya, and actually it's also growing. And we need these kind of figures so that we can see the direction that we are going. And we know, like for every acre that is being established with the Iroquois hybrids, it emerges like the three more maybe established from vegetative propagation, and that's still okay. As I said, even if you do vegetative propagation, although it's laborious, but even if it's a hybrid, it still maintains the genetic potential to give you good quality. So across the globe, you can see there's still a lot of gaps to be done in Africa to close the feed deficit gap. Not only in Kenya, also in Tanzania, they have similar requirement to be able to close the animal feed requirement gap. So in future outlook, would want to say that as animal source food continue to grow in this continent, I think we can be met sustainably if people actually continue or adopt cultivated forages. And of course, forage seed, forage and fodder and ruminant value chains, whether it's meat or milk, they are connected. And in the process, they also provide livelihoods for quite a number of households, including all gender. And as the global warming challenges take effect, forage cultivation contribute to environmental and ecosystem benefits because these forages, they can reduce the soil erosion, they can sequester carbon, because we would want the carbon in the atmosphere that's actually contributing to increasing temperatures sequestered into the soil. And because these forages are perennial, they sit in a particular plot of land for more than 10 years, they will help in actually sequestering the carbon. And they can, in addition to increasing the productivity, whether it's milk or meat. And they also present business opportunities. As an example, I've just given some groups or even cooperatives seeing an opportunity where they produce hay and they sell. And even if they take the cooperative group approach, they should be able to do a kind of nest meat and be able to provide members, probably through a check-off system where they can be able to make sure that also the farmers are able to give dairy cooperatives enough milk throughout the year. And or to do all this, in fact, also we need to have a supportive policy environment. And this one area also, together with other partners, CIAT has been working, especially around the forage seed policy in Kenya. We do have a draft and we are involving CAFES and State Department of Livestock to try and remove some of the bottlenecks we have seen. For example, how comes that within the COMESA catalog, we do not have any forage. The forages are conspicuously absent. And yet, for example, some maize varieties, once they are registered in a country or two, moving to that for the country is usually very easy. You don't require what they call the national performance trial. And we are trying to follow that route so that we can have material being adopted in various countries within this continent. And that we will also hasten the research and also have more options for different agroecological zones for our countries within Africa. And as I move towards finalization, I usually like this pictorial representation, or rather illustration. It actually summarizes the benefits that can accrue from growing forages. And if you look at the different colorations, the light blue actually representing the technologies, whether it's forage hybrids or cultivars, they can increase animal production and also sequester carbon. And when that's happening, there's also the environmental gains. The soil quality will be ameliorated, also benefits across the climate change, because if animals are getting better quality feeds, it means for every kilo of meat or a liter of milk, you're having less methane gas being produced. Instead of keeping two animals that are giving you 20 liters of milk and producing twice as much methane, you can actually keep one animal, get the same amount of milk, but have reduced the environmental footprint. And of course, as I had already alluded about more incomes, of course, coming from the value chains related with the forages that can also connect very well with the livestock sector, whether the beef or milk dairy. And some of the hybrids I have just indicated, cultivars, they can be available in Kenya. There's this company called the Grupo Papalotla or Nandi or Tropical Seed. It's an international company, and I have a contact of the key person there. And Alejandro, actually, with this company, whatever we produce, because we are basically research, we license them. For example, we have had engagement with the Grupo Papalotla for a contract of 20 years, maybe remaining 15. All the hybrids we give them is upon them to multiply, and they do multiply seeds and distribute worldwide within the tropics and subtropics. And Alejandro Bravo actually has been in Latin America, where actually in Latin America, as you have seen in my global map there, they have really intensified the adoption of these technologies. And this company commands 50% of forage seed sales within the Latin America. And we are lucky to have now Alejandro Bravo, who has been in Latin America for the last 20 years doing that. He'll be based in Nairobi now for the next 3 years. Starting, he has already come, but is coming February already to settle here and deepen, not just for Kenya, but within the region, whether it is Zambia, Uganda, Somaliland. He's really good in actually making sure and distributing the material. And he also works together with this other company, Cresco, that's also finalizing in terms of registration. I know this company is selling very nicely also in countries like Somaliland, the same material. Advantage crops, we already may be familiar with this, whether those hybrids, whether it's Mombasa, Panicums, and others, you can always get them. And they have an arrangement also with the Global Papalosa, the international one. And also some of the cultivars, like the Basilisk, Piata, MG4, you can also get them from public system like Caro or Jorok, so that seed availability is somehow getting closed in terms of the challenges. And we actually still need to improve the forage seed distribution. And I think it's only through the private sector that you can do it sustainably and successfully. Otherwise, for the research entities like us, we may not be able to do that well. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Thanks and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Daktari, for that very comprehensive presentation on grasses. We have all learned so much. I felt like I was back in my biology, my natural sciences class in university. It was quite comprehensive. And just to see if we got something, I don't know if there's anybody in the audience who would like to tell us the difference between forage hybrids and cultivars. You call them cultivars.
Cultivars, yes.
Yes. Anybody would like to tell us just a very short explanation of the difference between those two? You can just raise your hand and I will unmute you. Anybody? I think people are being shy today. Maybe Dr.
No,
you
they
could
should not be shy. They should not be shy. I think we learn across, and I'm also happy to learn also from them. But I'm sure somebody can see what they think about the cultivars and hybrids.
I'm seeing Dr. Shah has answered on the chat. He said a hybrid is a mixture of two types, while a cultivar is an original improved type. Is that correct, Daktari?
Sorry, come up again. I didn't get that.
He said a hybrid is a mixture of two types, while a cultivar is original improved type.
Yeah, it's on the right track. Yes, for hybrid in grasses, you can have two or three, but for a cultivar, it's the way it occurs naturally, but among so many lines, they have been selected over time. Also, although they say selection is part of breeding, but nothing has been improved in terms of crossing them. But because they are so good, they also end up being registered actually in different geographies. Whether you go to Latin America, you go to Asia, you still find some cultivars that have been registered because they are good, but nothing has been done to them in terms of breeding.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. There is a um, question about Super Napier Thailand variety, if it can grow in semi-arid or arsal regions too.
Super Napier, yeah, I have had a lot of questions around the Super Napier. And first of all, to say that for all grasses, as I said, the key thing, first of all, is the quality depends on the stage you're harvesting. For any napier, you harvest past 3 feet, you may have more fiber, but less crude protein. And more fiber means less digestibility. Now, in terms of growing in semi-arid areas, the ball game they can be different if you are thinking of irrigation, but I don't think it will produce as much as compared to areas where it's getting enough rainfall. And for the way I know Napier, it requires adequate rainfall for you to be able to get uh, harvestable and good dry matter yields from Napier grass. The other thing I have tried to talk with some of my colleagues, whether you are talking about Junkao or the Pakchong or Sumba Napier, some of those lines may be vulnerable to Napier smart, for example, or the Napier stunting disease that's quite prevalent in Western Kenya. And as you know, most of the Napier, for example, where we have high altitude within the counties within this central Kenya, it's the Napier smart disease, which can be quite devastating. But what we, in a given farm, what we advocate for is to have a wide genetic base, because it may be Napier smart today, it may be the stunt, you don't know what will come tomorrow. Otherwise, if your material gets affected, everything will get affected if you have kind of a monoculture of a certain variety. So the variety is also a heavy feeder, but at a given environment, with the deplete of the diseases, I think you can still get harvestable and good quality manure, good quality forage, depending if you are putting manure and you're harvesting at the right stage. But in terms of semi-arid, nothing will ever grow on zero moisture, including some of the best that are adapted in semi-arid areas. They do so because of what you call the evasive mechanism. When it's very, very tough, they will actually keep the crown down there until when the rains come back. And that's when they thrive. They have probably a shorter life cycle, and they're able to, again, kind of hibernate in quotes until when the weather improves. But to imagine that you continue, you get a crop that will be productive throughout the year under semi-arid or arid conditions is nearly too impossible. So it's a question of trying to see which management can fit there. So if it is in arid areas and you're thinking of irrigation, it's totally a different ball game.
So the message there is that it is possible, but with interventions.
Yeah.
The second question, can farmers after growing fodder apply for climate change carbon credits awarding?
That is not in the works now, but I know it's a big discussion, especially with some of my colleagues. We work together. They would want to see how this is actually captured and mainstreamed into that carbon credit system, because the forages, as you see, I've seen they are perennial, and there should be a way to have them actually adopted. And that's why we are pushing. They are not yet there. But to me, it's possible because just like trees, they are perennial, they sequester carbon, and there's no reason why if you don't, they should not be included. But before you get the nod from the people concerned, I think it will take a bit of convincing. But it's already in the works, especially with some of my colleagues.
All right. The next question, actually a question from myself. You mentioned that there are different business opportunities that can arise from growing forage. And you mentioned that there's actually a deficit of seeds. And I was wondering how, as a smallholder farmer, I can come in and take advantage of the seed deficit, because the providers that you mentioned, they seem to be international companies. So is there a way that me as a smallholder farmer can come in and contribute to the promoting forage through providing seeds to my fellow farmers?
Yeah, the seeds largely happens through vegetative across farmers. But what happens with the panicums and Eurocroa is that for you to get economic amount of seeds, and that should be about 400 kilos per hectare, you should be away from the equator to get the true botanical seed, not vegetative. You should be away from the equator because they have what you call the longer day length plant. They require longer day length for them to provide the synchronized flowering and seed setting. So they may provide some seed around the equator, but it will be very minimal. And we know some of the best places we have iterated around this should be around in countries like Zambia, Morocco, no, not Morocco, but Mozambique, or countries that are a bit south or a bit north. When you think of maybe Ethiopia towards the north, that may be viable in terms of forage seed. The private sector is also trying to have a keen eye around this for production in Africa, because most of the seeds currently actually is through importation, and this makes the seeds very expensive. And you'll find that a kilo of, say, Brachiaria costing around 5,000. That's maybe about $50 a kilo. The same kilo will cost about $80, say, in Brazil or in Thailand. And it's because of the logistics of how to get the seeds here. If you fly them in, the cost goes very high. Probably bigger consignment through the shipping, which the route currently they are trying. The costs may become a bit low, but not the what we would think may be the best for our smallholder farmers. So the private sector, those companies I showed, they are not all international. It's only the group of Paparosa, which is international. but the others are actually localized in Kenya, including another one I know in Uganda that's doing a lot of importation called Arete. And these are the people distributing, whether you think of Zambia, think of Tanzania, where we get a lot of requests. In Uganda, they are taking up very well. And I think the seed deficit may be there, but also how you produce the seed, economically, you'll have to be away from the equator for that to be successful. But vegetatively, we have also seen farmers, small farmer groups also doing vegetative, which I think they can also make money. But the bigger deficit also is around the feed, the dry matter itself, which it didn't require the seed to close the gap for the animal provision.
All right, thank you for that. There's another question from Dr. Shah. In Wasingishu, we are currently promoting super napier in our animal health and breeding program. Is that a good decision while comparing napier versus brachiaria?
I wouldn't say it's a bad decision, but I think you should try to quantify the amount of nutrients. For example, over time, say within one year, how much amount of metabolizable energy of crude protein are you getting per that unit area? And also, the key to that will also be when you are really harvesting this material. Because if the animal doesn't meet the body requirement, becomes challenging to actually also turn that into production itself. Because once the animal rumen is filled with material that are of poor quality, and that animal, once filled, cannot take more, it means the production will always be low. So it's usually very important to make sure whatever goes into that rumen is of good quality and contains especially metabolizable energy and crude protein. Otherwise, one field, you cannot put more, and that animal may not ingest more anyway. So I think it's a question of trying to iterate until where they can see they are getting the maximum crude protein and energy from the same per unit area.
So, in essence, it is the quality forage that is important.
That's the
Um,
underlying.
yes. Any other questions from our audience before we thank Dr. Ari for his presentation? I'm seeing that there's a question of sharing the slides that you have presented. Is it possible for you to share the slides so that we can share with our audience?
I will share.
So if you'd like a copy of the slides, I believe we have posted, and maybe Mary, you can repost the link to join the WhatsApp group to join DAFMA, so you can be able to have access to the presentation. As I mentioned before, we are also going to put this up on our YouTube page, the Perfometer YouTube page. I believe we shared the link for that, and you can also be able to take advantage of the other lessons that we have covered in this series on forages. I see we have the WhatsApp group link up. Kindly join our WhatsApp group where we share more information, and even this conversation usually carries on onto the WhatsApp group, including other conversations that are very important in our sector. So if we do not have any other questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Ari, for your time and for sharing the knowledge that you have shared with us. We've been having very many discussions surrounding forages and fodder. And you can see the interest that farmers have in understanding forages and fodder, because we all understand how important it is in our rations and in our economics as farmers, especially for dairy and beef farmers. Thank you for a very well put together presentation and a very good presentation. We hope to call on you once again here at Revuka when we have a subject surrounding your area of expertise. And also to our audience, thank you so much for joining us once again this afternoon. Remember to keep an eye out on the next Erevuka lesson. We hope that you were able to take something home to go and implement on your farms, or even to carry on to teach to farmers or other people within the sector, other stakeholders. Yes, so thank you so much and have a blessed afternoon.
Thank you too.